"Is this some sort of joke?" I demanded. He went all red and mumbly and tried to hide what he'd put, but I'd already seen it. "My best friend is Tracy Beaker." It was down there on the page in black and white. Well, not your actual black and white.
He put Harry's wand back into a box and wrapped it in brown paper, still muttering, "Curious, curious."
"Sorry,"
said Harry.
"but what's curious?"
Mr. Ollivander fixed Harry with his pale stare. "I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. Every single wand. It so happens that the Phoenix Tail, who was in your wand, given another feather, just one other. It is very curious indeed that you should be destined for this wand when his brother, Wyatt's brother, give you that scar." Harry swallowed.
September, Tuesday. First of all, let me get something straight. This is a journal, not a diary. I know what it says on the cover, but when Mum went to buy this thing, I specifically told her to get one that didn't say diary on it. Great. All I need for some jerk to catch me carrying this book around and get the wrong idea. The other thing I want to clear up right away was that this was Mum's idea, not mine. But if she thinks I'm going to write down all my feelings in here or whatever, she's crazy. So just don't expect me to be all Dear Diary this and Dear Diary that.
For suddenly, just behind him, James heard a rustling of leaves, and he turned round and saw an old man in a funny dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, but he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered all over with bristly black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away, and he stood there leaning on his stick and staring hard at James.
No one in town could understand how his garden could be so pretty, greeny, flowery and gardeny when his house was such a filthy tip. "Maybe he just likes gardening," said Jonathan Ripples, the fattest man in town. "Perhaps he's trying to win a garden contest," said a little girl called Peter. "I reckon he just likes gardening," said Martin Laundrette, who ran the laundrette. "Aye, that was my idea," said Jonathan Ripples. "No, it wasn't," said Martin Laundrette. "You can't prove it, Fatso." In fact, they were all wrong. The real reason was this. He had to keep the garden tidy, because otherwise an angry fairy would appear in his bathtub and start whacking him with a frying pan. You see, there's always a simple explanation for things.
It's a funny thing about mothers and fathers. Even when their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine, they still think that he or she is wonderful. Some parents go further. They become so blinded by adoration, they manage to convince themselves their child has qualities of a genius. Well, there is nothing very wrong with this. It's the way of the world. It is only when the parents begin telling us about the brilliance of their own revolting offspring that we start shouting, "Bring us a basin. We're going to be sick."
Mr. Stink stank. He also stunk. And if it is correct English to say he stinked, then he stinked as well. He was the stinkiest stinky stinker who ever lived. A stink is the worst type of smell. A stink is worse than a stench, and a stench is worse than a bong, and a bong is worse than a whiff, and a whiff can be enough to make your nose wrinkle. And it wasn't Mr. Stink's fault he stank. He was a tramp, after all. He didn't have a home, so he never had the opportunity to have a proper wash, like you and me. Make sure you wash your berries before eating them.
"What now?" they all said, looking at Mugglewump. "Aha!" cried Mugglewump. "Now for the fun. Now for the greatest upside-down trick of all time. Are you ready?" "We're ready," said the monkeys. "We're ready," said the birds. "Pull out the carpet," shouted Mugglewump. "Pull this huge carpet out from under the furniture and stick it to the ceiling."
Go.
Chapter 13. Bert's Burgers. Soon Zoe noticed she was running, but her short little legs were no match for the older, taller kids, who were soon barging past her so they could be first in the queue at the burger van to stuff their faces at lunch. Zoe shielded Armitage with her hand. She had been knocked to the ground in the school corridor so many times before. At last she made it out into the relative safety of the playground. She kept her head down, hoping not to be recognised. However, there was only one way out of the playground onto the main road. Every day there was the same grimy, beaten-up burger van parked outside, which had Bert's Burgers emblazoned across it. Even though the food from the van was horrible, the school dinners were even more nauseating, so most of the kids took the least worst opinion and queued up outside the van for their lunch. Bert was as unsavoury as the burgers he served. The self-styled chef always wore the same filthy striped top and grease-encrusted jeans, which he wore low down below his giant belly. Over the top hung a bloody overall. The man's hands were always filthy and his thick mop of hair was covered in flakes of dandruff the size of Rice Krispies. Even his dandruff had dandruff. The flakes would drop into the deep fat fryer, causing it to hiss and spurt whenever he leaned over it.
He found another jar of creamy stuff labelled hair remover. Smear it on your legs, it said, and allow it to remain for 5 minutes. George tipped it all into the saucepan. There was a bottle with yellow stuff inside it called Dishworth's famous dandruff cure. In it went. There was something called Brilliant for cleaning false teeth. It was a white powder. In that went too. He found another aerosol. Nevermore Ponking deodorant spray. Guaranteed, it said, to keep away unpleasant body odours for a whole day. She could use with plenty of that, George said as he sprayed the entire canful into the saucepan. Liquid paraffin, the next one was called. It was a big bottle. He hadn't the faintest idea what it did to you, but he poured it in anyway. Then he thought, looking around him, was that all from the bathroom? On his mother's dressing table in the bedroom, George found yet another lovely aerosol can. It was called Helga's Hair Set. Hold 12 inches away from the hair and spray lightly. He spurted the whole lot into the saucepan. He did enjoy squirting these aerosols.
Children are revolting, screamed the Grand High Witch. We will wipe them all away. We will scrub them off the face of the earth. We will flush them down the drain. Yes, yes, chanted the audience. Wipe them all away, scrub them off the earth, flush them down the drain. Children are foul and filthy, thundered the Grand High Witch. They are, chorused the English witches. They are foul and filthy. Children are dirty and stinky, screamed the Grand High Witch. Dirty and stinky, cried the audience, getting more and more worked up. Children are smelling of dog droppings, screeched the Grand High Witch. Pooh, cried the audience. Pooh, pooh, pooh. They are worse than dogs' droppings, screeched the Grand High Witch. Dogs' droppings are smelling like violets and primroses compared to children.
Mr. Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He'd always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in the summer the little balcony became a riot of colour. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself.
This is the story of Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there was always hundreds of bits of breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking to the hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or as his sleeve while he was eating. But if you look closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs and spinach and tomato ketchup and fish fingers and minced chicken livers and all other disgusting things Mr. Twit liked to eat.
It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall, its head was higher than the upstairs windows of the house. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall, dark figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On it came, nearer and nearer. But it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then it would move on, then it would stop again. But what on earth was it? Aha! Sophie could see what it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer into the upstairs window of each house in the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs windows. That's how tall it was. It would stop and peer in, then it would slide onto the next house and stop again and peer in, and so on along the street.
My father paused and glanced over his shoulder as though to make sure there was nobody at the door of the caravan listening. Method number 1, he said softly, is known as the horsehair stopper. The horsehair stopper, I murmured. That's it, my father said, and the reason it's such a brilliant method is that it's completely silent. There's no squawking or flapping around or anything else with the horsehair stopper when the pheasant is caught. And that's mighty important because don't forget, Danny, when you're up in those woods at night and the great trees are spreading their branches high above, you like black ghosts, it is so silent you can hear a mouse moving.
Dennis was different. When he looked in the mirror, he saw an ordinary 12-year-old boy, but he felt different. His thoughts were full of colour and poetry, though his life could be very boring. The story I'm going to tell you begins here, in Dennis's ordinary house on an ordinary street in an ordinary town. His house was nearly exactly the same as all the others in the street. One house had double glazing, another did not. One had a gravel drive, and another had crazy paving.
The rest of September was hard. I wasn't used to getting up so early in the morning. I wasn't used to this whole notion of homework. I got my first quiz at the end of the month. I never got quizzes when Mum homeschooled me. I also didn't like how I had no free time anymore. Before, I was able to play whenever I wanted to, but now it felt like I always had stuff to do for school. And being at school was awful in the beginning. Every new class I had was like a new chance for kids to not stare at me. They would sneak peeks at me from behind their notebooks or when they thought I wasn't looking. They would take the longest way around me to avoid bumping into me in any way, like I had some germ they could catch, like my face was contagious. In the hallways, which were always crowded, my face would always surprise some unsuspecting kid who maybe hadn't heard about me. The kid would make the sound you make when you hold your breath before going underwater, a little sound. This happened maybe 4 or 5 times a day for the first few weeks. On the stairs, in front of the lockers, in the library. 500 kids in a school. Eventually, every one of them was going to see my face at some time. And I knew after the first couple of days that word had gotten around about me, because every once in a while I'd catch a kid elbowing his friend as they passed me, or talking behind their hands as I walked by them. I can only imagine what they were saying about me. Actually, I prefer not to even try to imagine it.
You look like you wanted that one, sonny, the shopkeeper said pleasantly. Charlie nodded, his mouth bulging with chocolate. The shopkeeper put Charlie's change on the counter. Take it easy, he said. It'll give you a tummy ache if you swallow it like that without chewing. Charlie went on wolfing the chocolate. He couldn't stop, and in less than half a minute the whole thing had disappeared down his throat. He was quite out of breath, but he felt marvellously, extraordinarily happy. He reached out a hand to take the change, then he paused. His eyes were just above the level of the counter. They were staring at the silver coins lying there. The coins were all 5-penny pieces. There were 9 of them altogether. Surely it wouldn't matter if he spent just one more. I think, he said quietly, I think I'll have just one more of those chocolate bars. The same kind as before, please. Why not? The shopkeeper said, reaching behind him again and taking another Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight from the shelf. He laid it on the counter. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still. It's a golden ticket! Screamed the shopkeeper.